Jody Wilson Raybould, also known by her initials JWR and her ancestral name Puglaas, is a lawyer, advocate, and proud Indigenous Canadian. She was the independent MP for Vancouver Granville, and she's vying for that position again right now because we are in the midst of a federal election in Canada. She was elected as a Member of Parliament for the Liberal Party back in October 2015. Shortly thereafter, she was appointed Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, making her the first Indigenous person to serve in this portfolio. She then served as Minister of Veterans Affairs from January 2019 to February 2019, when she resigned. Prior to entering politics, she was a provincial Crown Prosecutor in Vancouver, a Treaty Commissioner, and Regional Chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations. She studied at University of Victoria and later University of British Columbia. She lives with her husband in Vancouver. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you for having me.
I want to read the first paragraph of the book.
Sure.
And the book is From Where I Stand, Rebuilding Indigenous Nations for a Stronger Canada, published by University of British Columbia Press.
Indeed.
A central lesson instilled in me from a very young age was to be careful with words because you cannot take them back. You must always speak the truth. This has been a vital teaching and one that has guided me in my relationships as I strive to always be thoughtful and considerate in working with others. So why did you start with that paragraph?
Well, I mean, thank you for having me here again and to chat about this book. I started with that paragraph because this book represents 10 years of work in various roles, and in those various roles I had a certain amount of influence and being able to give speeches and lectures on such an important topic as Indigenous rights and reconciliation. I took great responsibility in that and wanted to ensure that the words I spoke were thoughtful and contributed towards a dialogue and discussion to support Indigenous peoples and the rest of Canada moving towards true reconciliation. And the basis upon which I've approached my roles as regional chief and as minister is rooted and grounded in my culture and my teachings. And I come from an oral society where if you do not speak the truth, then your culture dies. So that's something that has stayed with me throughout my life and in the roles that I've held.
Now, forgive me for raising this offensive idiom or saying, but when you wrote, careful with words because you cannot take them back, I automatically thought of Indian giver, and I wonder if you were purposefully addressing that.
Oh, that's interesting reflection. It wasn't something that was in my mind when I wrote it. It was just really rooted in who how I was raised, and knowing exactly what it says, words matter and words have impact on people, particularly around important issues, emotional issues, and at times debilitating topics for people that bring back memories and sometimes harm.
Because that is an offensive stereotype, and this addresses it head on.
Yeah, who I am is what you get. You ask me a question and I'll give you an answer to it, and what I've found or what's carried me through various political roles that I've held. If you say the same thing, no matter what the audience or who the audience, then you can never get yourself into any kind of trouble.
Yeah, that's how you end off the book, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It was proven by the ethics commissioner that you did tell the truth when you were in front of the Justice Committee, that means that people who contradicted you weren't telling the truth.
Well, for whatever reason or other people provided information, I was throughout a period of time that was extremely difficult and challenging around the whole matter with respect to the topic of the Ethics Commissioner's report, the 4.5-hour testimony that I had before the Justice Committee, reflecting on my role as the Attorney General with respect to the Director of Public Prosecutions and the whole SNC affair. It wasn't easy, but it was easy for me to sit there and to have clearly understood my role as the Attorney General, having been someone that continues to take copious notes and a detailed memory, was speaking the truth. And I know that the truth always comes out, and I felt vindication for the independence of the Office of the Attorney General and the Director of Public Prosecutions when the Ethics Commissioner released his report.
Mm-hmm. Last week I interviewed John Ivison about his biography of Trudeau, and he remarked that about trust, that he trusts most politicians to give him back his wallet if they found it, but not to tell the whole truth. And I guess you're saying that you haven't been able to tell the whole truth.
Well, in terms of the whole discussion and issue around SNC,
yeah.
Well, I have provided all of the relevant information that I have with respect to SNC and what happened during the time that I was the Attorney General. And that was the waiver that was provided in terms of cabinet confidences, solicitor-client privilege, and oath that I've taken. So I've provided, during that period of time, all the relevant information.
So there isn't another bombshell you want to drop then?
I mean, as was stated in the Ethics Commissioner's report, there are other individuals that he would have liked to have had discussions with. Beyond what I've been privy to, I suspect and know to a certain degree that there's other information that other individuals have with respect to this particular issue. But as for me, in terms of my engagements and my role as the AG, all of that information right now is in the public domain. Okay. Anything beyond that is still, in terms of my discussions with the Prime Minister or otherwise, subject of confidence.
So you don't feel like you've been muzzled then?
Well, there was the waiver, so I was able to impart my experience, and that's reflected in the Commissioner's report. So in terms of the information that I have, that's been provided.
Okay. Let's move on to the important stuff.
Okay.
The book, basically you want to galvanize action, you say in the book, to further the cause of self-government. Now, Alberto Manguel, the famed bibliophile, spoke to me about this recently. He said that you have set back that cause by making Trudeau out to be a liar. Would you agree with that or not?
I don't agree with that.
You're not in power anymore, though. You're an independent. So how does that help you further the cause if you're away from the levers of power?
Well, I mean, there's no question that being a Minister of the Crown, being the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General brings with it a significant amount of power and the ability to introduce legislation. I was very proud to have introduced 14 pieces of legislation, all of which received royal assent, and I'm incredibly proud of that work. But in terms of Justin Trudeau and our interaction, I do not feel that I did anything to him I was simply in my role as the Attorney General doing my job. And I, as I said earlier, understood that job, understood my responsibility to uphold the independence of the justice system. And had I, or if I was to have been provided the opportunity to do it again, I would do it exactly the same. And I do not believe that being in power is more important than upholding one's principle. And if we get to that place, then the decisions we make we can't get to a place where power overcomes principle, because the decisions we make are not going to stand the test of time, and it undermines the very nature of our democracy, and that's what I was working towards ensuring was upheld.
And that's why so many people admire you.
Oh, well, I have received a significant amount of support right across the country and even beyond, and it is heartwarming to know that Canadians appreciate and are having discussions around the rule of law, around the independence of our institutions, and wanting to believe that there are politicians in Ottawa that have integrity.
That's why I wished you were running in my riding.
Well, you can always move to Vancouver Granville.
Let's build the case then, your case, starting in 1763, because throughout these speeches you make reference to important decisions and events that have taken place in Canadian history. So George III made a Royal Proclamation, and a wampum belt was involved. Perhaps you could talk about that briefly.
Sure. Well, the speeches try to, given the context and where they were, to give a bit of historical background with respect to the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown government. And back in 1763, I speak in some of the speeches about wampum being presented to the Crown. And this isn't from my culture, but in the wampum, that gift provided to the Crown means that two cultures coming together, respecting one another's laws and traditions and ways of being, and coexisting peacefully side by side, not interfering with one's governing structures, but again, coexisting. And that was the basis upon which Indigenous peoples in the Crown came together. And a lot has happened in the intervening years since wampum was originally presented to the Crown, in that things changed as time passed, and the Crown governments sought to impose their laws and their policies on Indigenous peoples for the worse, in terms of denying their rights and the recognition that they were the original inhabitants of this land.
Mm-hmm. Then Confederation in 1867, where assimilation became the policy.
Mm-hmm. I speak about, and this is the work that we're trying to remedy right now, when the so-called Fathers of Confederation came together to create our country. Indigenous peoples weren't present. They were left out. Jurisdiction being divided between the central government and the provinces. What we have been trying to do ever since is to correct that absence of Indigenous peoples around that table, and enable Indigenous peoples to have rights recognition and see themselves reflected in the mirror of our Constitution. That's the work that Indigenous peoples since the beginning of this country have been trying to advocate for, have been very successful in doing so, using mechanisms like the courts for their recognition of their rights.
What's the Indian Act, and when did that come into place?
The Indian Act is a colonial piece of legislation that still exists, has been amended many times, came into place in 1876, And the Indian Act sought to control and does to a great degree still the lives of Indigenous peoples from the time, First Nations peoples, from the time they're born to the time that their will, administering their will upon their death. But
the rewards of the state,
the
right?
rewards of the state.
Mm-hmm.
It has had significant impact, terrible impact on removing traditional systems of government and imposing an impoverished notion of government on Indigenous peoples, placing Indigenous peoples on reserve and controlling their lives, as I said, in every aspect.
Kind of formed a dependency on what, government handouts?
Definitely, and the government is the trustee overseeing their wards, the Indians on reserve, and it has created a significant level of dependency wherein Indigenous peoples look to the government for funding in terms of programs and services around education, around housing.
So what, they've just become used to it being given to them, or whatever Canadians deem appropriate to give?
Whatever the Department of Indian Affairs provides to Indigenous communities on reserve, to the great degree of issuing a status card to an Indigenous person that says, yes, you are an Indian under the Indian Act. So taking away nations' ability, as they once had, to determine who their citizens are, something so core to a nation. Now you are identified as a number in the eyes of the federal government. I mean, I still have a status card in my wallet right now that says that I am from Waiwakai, Cape Mudge, and I have a registration number.
And what does that give you?
It gives you, it provides the ability, if you are on reserve and you purchase goods, that you get tax-free goods. But beyond that, and some people look at that as being a significant benefit, beyond that, it represents a colonial statute that dictates where you are registered, where you live. That is somewhat completely, well, it is completely opposite from being from territory, from being part of a nation and a government. My community, my nation, the Kwak'wala nation, is now divided up as a result of the Indian Act into 15 Indian Act bands. That's not how we governed ourselves historically, and certainly we still have hereditary chiefs and we still practice our system of government in the potlatch. But we also have elected Indian Act chiefs, and we're going through this process of trying to deconstruct our colonial reality and get back to the place, not where we once were historically, because I don't think we can ever get back there, but our laws and our ways of being and making decisions. We can move back to that place to determine what our core institutions of government are, how we elect our governing body, determining who our citizens are, having a constitution that brings back together as much as we can those 15 Indian Act bands into a place where we have a governing body, a land base from which to build our community.
And the problem is the heads of these bands they probably like being the heads of those bands and they don't want to give anything up. Is that the problem? Or one of them? Or is that too simple?
Well, I mean, every Indian Act band is different and have different realities. Indigenous communities are among the most impoverished communities in the country. Third world conditions in a first world country has been coined. You know, people are living in the fourth world, and there are significant challenges with housing, high suicide rates, the lack of potable water in communities across the country has had crippling impacts on individuals, and we need to, as a country, in my view, and I hope in the view of many Canadians, we need to have parity in terms of investment into Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples with that of the rest of Canada and Canadians. That's simply not the case right now.
Mm-hmm.
So living in the fourth world certainly has an impact on individuals, and trying to remove oneself from that reality.
So you're obviously an exception then.
We are seeing success in communities,
Yeah.
But there are many individuals, many communities that are still challenged by the colonial legacy, and that's understandable.
Mm-hmm.
Moving away from dependency and having lived under the reality of the Indian Act for as long as it's been in place, change is hard. Change, it creates fear, and we need to look to where we're having success and where Indigenous communities have been moving away from the Indian Act.
Fear that they're not going to be taken care of anymore, that they have to do everything themselves?
Fear of change and dependency, instills fear of not being able to have what you have been accustomed to, or
even though it's not that great.
And not understanding what is beyond the post-colonial door, and how if we as Indigenous peoples have the ability to be self-determining, have the ability to build an economy and to take back control and make decisions for oneself, how much more better off Indigenous communities will be, and certainly the country will be.
Then there was the Charter in 1982, and specifically Section 35.
Mm-hmm. So I think that, I was 11 years old in 1982. I believe that many Canadians look back on 1982, look back at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and patriation of our Constitution as a significant time in Canadian history. And beyond healthcare, thinking about the Charter and rights and freedoms that have been upheld in this country is something that defines us as Canadians.
Sort of independence from England too, partly.
Yeah, absolutely. And developing more so our own identity. And since 1982, the Charter being in our Constitution and Section 35, which recognizes and affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights, the same was true for Indigenous peoples, having that placed into the Constitution. That represented a new beginning, the enshrinement of rights and the opportunities that could present, or that are at that time presented. My father and many other leaders were around that table, and the expressions of hope and optimism as a result was palatable. And beyond 1982, charter rights evolved as they should, and
there were all sorts of court cases that were won by Indigenous groups. 170 of them so far.
Well, and it's interesting, and I have some reflections in the book about the evolution of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and some reflections on Section 35 and what's happened with respect to Section 35 since 1982. Very different evolution of rights, where in terms of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we see that in terms of our identity. And when somebody says, I have the freedom of expression or religion or equality, the governments have sought to uphold those rights at every turn by introducing legislation, policy, and rightfully so. It's not true with respect to Section 35, where Indigenous peoples have advocated for rights or put forward an Indigenous right to fish, or sought a declaration of title as a result of Section 35, which Indigenous communities view as a full box of rights. The response of that assertion, or saying, I have the inherent right to self-government, the response by the governments of the day up to including today has been prove it, which is why Indigenous communities have had to go to court so many times to have courts which they have, as you say, in 170 plus cases to uphold their rights. Our challenge and opportunity as Canadians, as governments, is to acknowledge the victories that have occurred in the courts, the leadership role that justices have taken. For example, in Chilcotin, having the first declaration of Aboriginal title.
That's 2014, right? Yeah.
Our challenge is to take that leadership role and create the space for rights recognition and beyond the courts, beyond that adversarial environment, and actually build a new relationship together.
In all fairness, though, the Canadian government has been funding all of these challenges.
Well, there's in what sense that many Indigenous communities have gone to court and have gotten judgments at the end of the day and costs provided. But
I know some lawyers have become very rich because of that.
There has been an industry built around it. There's been a lot of lawyers that have made a significant amount of money advocating for Aboriginal rights and bringing rights in title cases to the courts. That's true.
You can't argue with all these precedents.
Well, it's all of these court cases and leadership from Sparrow and Delgamuukw to Chilcotin that has created the space where we are right now, and the advocacy that has been brought by Indigenous leaders into the courts. Certainly they have had representation, but we need to recognize that we're not going to resolve these tough issues in the courts and look for alternative ways to reconcile.
Yeah, because you want to turn these rights into benefits.
Absolutely.
And, when I go to events and people talk about the fact that we're on specific lands, right in Montreal, right in Ottawa, what does that mean? In your eyes, does that mean that Ottawa is owned by a band?
We can unpack that question. I think a lot about the land acknowledgements and how prevalent the land acknowledgements have come, no matter where you are in the country, and government officials acknowledging the land, businesses when they open up conferences. And I think it's really important, but if we are to think a little bit further about those acknowledgements, I wonder what people think they mean. For me, and I think words are important and those acknowledgements are important, but I think beyond that, an understanding of what it actually means to know that Indigenous peoples were here on these lands prior to the arrival of Europeans, and that means something. This is the question that we as Indigenous peoples and our leaders before us have been advocating and fighting in the courts for, is the recognition of those rights, which includes title.
Title, recognition, I understand. Title, what does that mean?
Title to the land, that there are particular pieces of land in this country where there is Aboriginal title. For example, the Chilcotin, as we said, went to the Supreme Court of Canada. The first declaration of Aboriginal title to land was through the Chilcotin in the Namaya Valley in British Columbia. They have been on that land since time lost in memory, have conducted themselves as sophisticated societies on that land, although somewhat nomadic, and have built their community and lived off that land. They have title to that land.
What about Ottawa or Montreal?
Well, there are Indigenous communities that have lived in those areas as well, and there are certain portions of that land where we don't want to have every Indigenous community go to court to seek a declaration of title, but there needs to be some recognition of rights to territory in order for an Indigenous community to move forward, to rebuild, to expand, to build their governments around. And through that, we will be able to have the resources to build our governing institutions and contribute towards what I see as an amazing evolving cooperative federalism between and among different levels and orders of government.
Yeah, I mean, you need money in order to build up these communities, to develop communities, to develop an economy. But what about Ottawa? Like, what would happen is the city of Ottawa would say, okay, this is yours, sorry we took it. You can have a percentage of the taxes that come off that land, or, I mean, is that one possibility?
Well, I definitely think it's a possibility in terms of sharing revenue and dividing up the revenue pie. We need to move beyond the fear that Indigenous peoples are going to take over major cities. And while they may have occupied those lands prior to people coming here, we have decisions that come out of the Supreme Court of Canada rightfully saying we're all here to stay. And for me personally, and I suspect the vast majority of Indigenous communities, we're not wanting to remove non-Indigenous peoples from these lands, but figure out a respectful way where we can live together and where Indigenous peoples can be self-determining, including self-government. In order to have a functioning government, you have to have revenues that support that government. Yeah. And when the country was created, when that discussion was happening, the revenue pie was divided between and among the federal government and the provinces. There needs to be a fiscal policy and that includes Indigenous peoples and that provides Indigenous nations with the revenues that come from the land and a sharing of those revenues. Not everything, but we live in a federation and that includes Indigenous governments, and in order for proper functioning governments you have to have a revenue base, and that potentially could include taxation and other revenues that come in.
And also enforcing your own laws.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that will look different in terms of what jurisdictions Indigenous communities want to draw down, depending on their priorities. But we'll have to be able, a law is only as good as its ability to be enforced.
Here's Conrad Black talking about your guide to nation building that you wrote with your husband, Tim Raybould. It's a toolkit for the self-emasculation of Canada as a sovereign jurisdiction.
Well, I really don't take too much stock in comments by Mr. Black. When I was the regional chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations, we worked incredibly hard with Indigenous leaders to reflect the work that Indigenous communities in British Columbia and across the country were doing in terms of moving through the post-colonial door, in terms of removing themselves from the Indian Act in many ways, whether it be around land management or developing a fiscal management law or sectoral governance reforms in the area of education, or negotiating self-government agreements or comprehensive treaties. There is a lot of success of Indigenous communities rebuilding, and the toolkit is an amalgamation and a celebration of the work that Indigenous communities have done. And I'm incredibly proud of it, and I believe that as Indigenous communities move along what I like to call a continuum of governance reform, and federal governments and provincial governments need to open the post-colonial door for Indigenous communities to walk through it at their own pace and based on their own priorities. That obviously assists Indigenous communities in improving their quality of life and ensuring practicing and thriving cultures, building an economy, of course helping their communities, but broadly speaking, helping the country. This is the unfinished business of Confederation, and anybody that looks to rebuild or looks at the rebuilding of Indigenous nations within a stronger Canada is someone that has missed the point.
And it's a stronger Canada because it's a juster Canada, you say? Why is it stronger?
Well, I mean, we can think about it in terms of if we have a neighbor or we have a house and our neighbor's house is not as good as our house, or it impacts us, it impacts our property value. If we have a neighbor that is his or her house is well taken care of, built well, it improves our neighborhood. I know that's not necessarily the best analogy.
Well, I think it's one that would strike home with many Canadians, for sure.
For the vast majority of this country's history, Indigenous communities were forgotten at the end of a gravel road, and we need to ensure that every person in this country, including Indigenous peoples, have the opportunity to be self-determining, to make decisions for themselves, their communities, and their nations, to be strong and to contribute towards this great country. And I was always taught, and I reflect on this in the book, that everybody in a community has a role to play, everybody in the country has a role to play, and if you're inhibited from playing that role, then the community and the country suffers. So the ability to provide the same opportunities in this country for everyone to succeed is going to improve the country. That's what a just society means, where there's equality and inclusion and opportunity.
It's interesting that Pierre Trudeau really pushed the just society. Atrocities have been committed against many, many groups and peoples and nations in the world. Mm-hmm. Why should this generation pay for it?
In terms of remedying those injustices, we have to. Societies will be judged by how they treat their most vulnerable. The inability to achieve or create the space for true reconciliation with Indigenous peoples has and will continue to hold the country back. And remedying or addressing the wrongs of the past puts us on a foundation to move into a better future. I am very heartened by discussions that I have with Canadians right across the country who are becoming more aware of our history through important reports like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, the recent Murdered and Missing Women's report, and their calls for justice. We need to understand that history and in order to move, as I say, beyond it, to remedy those wrongs, to make sure that everyone's on an equal footing.
Yeah, if Canada's not going to do it, then who else? I mean, I think that's why I was so impressed with what you did. It's like, that's what we want. We want honesty in politics. Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't just sort of shake our head and say that's politics.
No, I mean, I think we live in one of, if not the best countries in the world, and we need to continue to be an example throughout the world in terms of justice and human rights, and how we engage with and relate and build relationships as a country with its original inhabitants, with Indigenous peoples, is something that we need to be an example for throughout the world. And nation states came together back in 2007 and for the most part endorsed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which provides minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples within throughout the world. And Canada can be an example about how to significantly operationalize those minimum standards here in Canada and create the space for rebuilding.
In your society or your world, your system, you're known as a Hilgast.
Haligasti. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, close enough. Not really.
That's okay.
Quote, one who correct, this is just, it couldn't have been written any better. one who corrects the chief's path. Like, were you thinking about that when you? It was about the rule of law. That's what you took your stand on, but you were also correcting the chief. The chief.
Right. It's the first speech I gave after I became Minister of Justice and Attorney General. I spoke, and it's not in the book, but there's a lot of common themes through the speeches that I've given. I spoke about our potlatch system and our traditions, and I come from, in many important ways, a matrilineal culture, which means, descendancy and passes through the female line. And in our potlatch, in our system of government, men are always chiefs. We call them hamatzas. And symbolically in our potlatch, a hiligasti, of which I am one, guides the chief, the hamatza, into the big house and essentially tames that chief and determines when that chief is ready to lead. And my grandmother, her name was Puglaas, said that women are far too important and too busy to be chiefs, but we guide the chiefs. And it's interesting how that role, I think has followed me, not to say that I am guiding people, but in my role as the Attorney General, that was my responsibility, to be the caretaker of the justice system, to defend the independence of our institutions and uphold the rule of law.
So men are the bosses, but women make all the decisions.
Men are the chiefs, and women help to guide the chiefs in my culture. And I think in life, if men and women are all actively engaged in decision making, we have better decisions. That's for sure.
Okay. I just want to talk a bit about the book itself. There's already a lot of work that's gone into it by just the writing of and delivering of the speeches. But basically, it was a matter of editing and repackaging, and then getting it out at the right time. Now, if blackface hadn't happened, I think you might have made a bigger splash, or maybe not. What do you think?
It's hard to say. I am pleased that the book came out now, and maybe this is a book about policy, and I hope, and even in my the elevated attention that I'm receiving, putting this out as somewhat of an archive of what Indigenous communities have been advocating for over a decade. I hope it plays an important part in the conversation, and I believe the Indigenous issues should be an important part of the conversation in terms of leading up to the federal election. So I hope it contributes towards that discussion. It was purposeful for me to have it out at this time. I actually wanted to, when I stepped down as regional chief prior to entering into federal politics, I wanted to publish a book of my speeches back then in 2015. And I was convinced not to do it by a number of people saying, don't focus on the campaign. And it was my decision, but I regret that decision. But now, fast forward, I find that the speeches that are included, and there's many more, I find it interesting in the sense of the different perspectives that I had, or the different roles, from being regional chief and being the Minister of Justice, and nobody has ever been in that position. I know that there will be many more people in that position, but to provide some reflections on the issues and to contribute that towards the discussion is why I wanted to get it out so fast, and certainly UBC Press was very accommodating and worked incredibly hard to do it. It was an interesting process to go to. I worked very closely with Leslie Erickson, who was my amazing editor, there was a lot of overlap in many of the speeches that I gave.
Yeah.
We tried to edit it down to themes, which I think work in the book, and trying to provide an equal balance between speeches that were given when I was regional chief, when I was the Minister of Justice and Attorney General, and the last speeches when I was removed by the Prime Minister from the caucus. And that speech was reflections of my being a member of Parliament. And then, a lot of reflections and speeches given outside of the country. And
South Africa, Australia. Yeah.
And going back through them and rereading them and editing them took me right back to the time when I was delivering those speeches or giving those lectures. And interesting times from giving a speech in front of the former Prime Minister Harper at the First Nations Crown Gathering, or providing reflections on the recent passing of Nelson Mandela, to giving speeches to a large room when I was Minister of Justice. It was good to go back and think about those times and remark, for me, how things have changed, but the issues and the solutions remain the same.
I was struck by the fact that the formulators of apartheid in South Africa referred to the Indian Act.
Yeah, a lot of similarities between Canada and South Africa, although the Indigenous population in South Africa far eclipses our population, which is still hovering around 5%.
You mentioned, just in closing here, you mentioned leaving the caucus or being kicked out of the caucus. Here's Conrad one more time. It was a scandalous and an outrageous abuse of her office that, as attorney for the Crown, she ordered her officials to capitulate to Indigenous claimants. This was a directive.
Yeah, I suspect, and maybe I'm wrong in this, that Mr. Black didn't read the directive. I am incredibly proud of the directive on Indigenous civil litigation that in one of my last acts as the Attorney General, was to release publicly, to show how we as a department, the Department of Justice, have been working for prior to that, the last 18 months to 2 years. And the directive was developed in concert with my public servants, who took it very seriously. And overall, if I'm going to summarize, the objective of the directive was to do everything we can as Canada, as lawyers for Canada, to remove cases from the courts, to try and find other pathways to build relationships, knowing the history of the Crown Indigenous relationships. That history hasn't been built in the courts, but we need to look to other arrangements, other agreements that we can engage in to actually create the space to build the relationships based on the recognition of rights, as opposed to going to court and saying those rights don't exist. And then when we're forced to do something by the courts, then we do it at that time. We're never going to get anywhere if we continue to do that. That's not to say that there won't be court cases, but going to court should be the last resort, and the directive sought, and I hope it continues to focus on relationships first, as opposed to the adversarial nature of courts.
Which is a very an Indigenous way of arriving at solutions, more so than the litigious approach. I don't know how practical it is, but...
Well, the way that governments have been operating and taking approach to deny rights at every turn has not worked. And we need to, and I sought to do this when I was the Attorney General with respect to Indigenous peoples, and more broadly, take a different view or a different approach, a different perspective on risk and risk management. And what are the costs of not creating the space to build relationships with Indigenous peoples? What are the costs to continuing to try and look to the courts to define our relationship. We need to take the bull by the horns and take a leadership role that the courts have been playing for so long, and have the political will to actually do the hard things that need to be done without excuses. And that's going to take all of us. It's not going to take one government, but it's going to take transformative leadership, and as much as we can, removing discussion around Indigenous rights and Indigenous reconciliation away from partisan politics. It's the opportunity we have as a country.
I'm loath to bring this final point up, but it did disturb me as a fan of yours when I saw the report on Global TV about spousal travel and the fact that you were able to take advantage of that to the tone of about 10 times the average of what other MPs did. I just wonder how you account for that.
Well, I am very grateful that there is a House of Commons policy that enables members of Parliament to designate somebody to travel. And, getting involved in federal politics was not an easy decision for me, and I suspect for many other people. And my husband and I...
Your husband is a lobbyist for Native groups. His job is to come to Ottawa often, no? Or no?
Well, my husband's not a lobbyist. He has built his life around working with Indigenous communities for over 30 years and has worked with many in British Columbia. But that is separate and apart from your question in terms of expenses and travel. We had, as a couple, made a decision to ensure that we put our marriage first, and that because he had the ability to travel with me.
You wanted to see him as much as you could.
I welcomed it.
Yeah.
And I don't believe that the cost...
So you're still in love then?
I take my marriage and vows very seriously, and the cost of public service can't come at the expense of families or your relationship.
Yeah. And you were taking advantage of a program that was there for that, and no one said you couldn't, I guess. Is that it?
Yeah, there's a House of Commons policy that members of Parliament are able to utilize to be able to try to have some semblance of work-life balance.
And it destroys marriages, for sure.
Well, I mean, when I first came to Ottawa, like other members of Parliament, you have an orientation, and the orientation, I remember it distinctly. People that were presenting said, be careful. I mean, alcohol is around, and
other women, other men.
And that there are many divorces. I'm fortunate to have a very supportive husband, and it was no coincidence, I suspect, that I was raised as an issue in terms of expenses around the same time that the election was called. So.
Yeah, we'll leave it at that.
And I would, thank you.
The book is really, you ask me, it's about keeping promises and telling the truth.
I love those messages. Keeping or holding true and embracing solutions that Indigenous peoples and others have brought forward to enable Indigenous communities to rebuild, to be self-determining within a stronger Canada is going to be good for our country.
Country we can be proud of.
Country we can be proud of, one that's built on principle, one that embraces Indigenous peoples, and I hope to a great degree Indigenous peoples' world's view around collaboration, around consensus-based decision-making, around, and I'm reflecting on my own culture, around valuing every individual within the community and ensuring that individuals can achieve their full potential. That's what I hope is imparted here in some of the pages of this book, and that this is an undertaking that we as a country, in terms of finding true reconciliation between Indigenous peoples, among Indigenous peoples and the rest of the Canadians. That's the opportunity we have to finish the unfinished business of Confederation.
Well, I hope you win your seat.
Thank you. I'm gonna.
I hope you win it resoundingly.
Well, I do.
How's
as
it
well. It looks good. We are getting support from right across the country. I have an amazing team that, while I'm here talking to you in Ottawa, and I'll be flying back there on Sunday, is working incredibly hard on what we call Super Saturday, and it's Super Saturday 6 right now. And
why is it Super Saturday?
We just call it Super Saturday because we do door knocking and a whole bunch of activities to reach out to people in Vancouver Granville, and we have hundreds of volunteers that are on the streets right now and keeping us engaged. And I look forward to the federal election. I have always been one to work incredibly hard. I know that running as an independent is not something that happens every day, but I'm going to do everything I can to hopefully re-earn the trust and support of the voters of Vancouver Granville.
And hopefully you'll bash away at the partisan political bullshit that we have to put up with.
Hopefully. We live in a hyper-partisan world, and that's reflected in some of the discussion that's happening in this federal election campaign. I mean, we're not going to resolve the major issues of our time, particularly climate change or Indigenous reconciliation, if we think that the solutions and the answers are confined to one party. All 338 members of Parliament that are elected on October 21st have to come together with the best ideas and solutions to build a plan on climate change, a bold plan of climate action that lives beyond the life of one government. That's our opportunity, and the hyper-partisan nature of politics has eclipsed policy, it's eclipsed people. Honesty and Canadians' voices, and we need to take it back. And I hope that people, when they go out to vote on October the 21st or before in advance polls, that they consider who will best represent them, who will best represent their voices in Ottawa, as opposed to having members of Parliament who represent Ottawa back in their constituents. So we're looking to have a very representative Parliament and do what we can in terms of democratic reform to change the parliamentary standing orders and look at electoral reform to make our democracy more representative.
And you've got a good partner in Jane Philpott.
Jane Philpott, yes, also running as an independent in Markham Stouffville. Jane and I have become very good friends over the last 4 years, and I see in Jane the best minister of the Crown our country has ever had. She is a woman that stands up on principle, and in the face of standing alone, resigned from cabinet on that principle, and Canadians should be incredibly proud to have somebody like that in Parliament, and I am very hopeful that the voters of Markham Stouffville will agree.
The book is From Where I Stand, Building Indigenous Nations for a Stronger Canada. The author is Jody Wilson Raybould. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.